It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia, with the gentle hum of city life filtering through the air. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted out from a corner cafe, enveloping the street in a warm, inviting embrace. Inside, the cozy atmosphere was alive with the sound of low conversations, the occasional clink of coffee cups, and the steady hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. The cafe, small yet charming, was a haven for locals seeking a moment of escape. Amid the scattered tables, Baron Trump sat near the window at a small table, his tall frame hunched over a thick book. The soft murmur of voices blended into the background as he tried to focus on the pages in front of him, his fingers lightly tracing the words. He wasn't trying to draw attention, wearing only a plain hoodie and jeans, trying to blend into the crowd. To him, this was a simple retreat, a moment of quiet away from the chaos of his public life. As the youngest son of a former president, his world was often a whirlwind of appearances, scrutiny, and never-ending media attention. But here, in this ordinary cafe among strangers, he felt an unusual sense of anonymity. The constant hum of bustling patrons and the clattering of cups was the perfect backdrop for him to lose himself in the pages of his book. Baron was lost in the world of his novel when a sharp, angry voice suddenly cut through the soft noise of the cafe. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The words were loud enough to make heads turn, a few startled patrons glancing up from their conversations. Baron froze, caught off guard, his eyes lifting from his book to meet the source of the disturbance. Standing a few feet away from his table was a man in his late 40s, with a weathered face, worn by time and hardship. His eyes were wide with anger, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his whole body radiating tension. He wasn't dressed poorly, but his clothes, though clean, had the unmistakable wear of someone who had seen hard times. There was an edge to his voice that sent a ripple of unease through the room, a rawness that made the air feel heavier. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man continued, his voice trembling with rage. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The tension in the cafe thickened. Several patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or keep quiet. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone, ready to call for help if things escalated. Baron, however, remained still, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the man's intensity. Slowly, he closed his book, placing it down gently on the table, and looked up at the man. "Sir," Baron began, his voice steady but quiet, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" His tone was biting, almost mocking. The cafe fell eerily silent, all eyes now on the unfolding scene. People held their breaths, waiting for Baron to react. But what happened next was completely unexpected. Instead of matching the man's aggression, Baron did something no one anticipated. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes never leaving the man's. The tension in the air seemed to pulse through the room, the man's anger still radiating, making even the onlookers uncomfortable. But Baron didn't flinch. Instead, with a calm gesture, he pointed to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," Baron said, his tone soft but firm, his invitation disarming in its simplicity. The man faltered for a moment, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected offer. But his anger didn't waver. He stood there, glaring down at Baron, his fists still clenched, his body stiff with defiance. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you?" he sneered. "You're just another spoiled kid who will never know what it's like to live in the real world." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances as they wondered if they should intervene. The barista behind the counter remained tense, her hand still hovering near the phone, uncertain. But Baron didn't break. "Maybe you're right," he admitted softly. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For a brief moment, the man hesitated. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if Baron's words had struck a chord. But the anger didn't fade. Instead, it twisted into something more bitter. The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping but retaining its sharp edge. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" His words dripped with sarcasm. Baron's gaze remained steady. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he said simply, his words hanging in the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. The man hesitated, as if unsure whether to lash out again or accept the invitation for conversation. His fists unclenched slightly, his body language shifting ever so subtly. The silence in the cafe deepened, and everyone waited for the man's response. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor, his frustration palpable in every movement. With a grunt, he dropped into the seat, his arms crossing defensively over his chest, his eyes scanning Baron with suspicion, as if searching for any hint of insincerity. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tension in the cafe shifted, though it wasn't gone entirely. The barista, who had been frozen in place, slowly lowered her hand from the phone, and the patrons who had been holding their breath leaned in just a little bit closer. Baron nodded, leaning forward slightly, his expression calm but genuine. "I'm listening." And so the man began to speak. But what came next wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, as if steadying himself before pouring out the years of pain that had accumulated behind his words. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason," he began, his voice thick with bitterness. "But you don't know what it's like to lose everything." His eyes flicked around the cafe, daring anyone to interrupt. "I had a job, a family, a decent life, but then the factory I worked at shut down, just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us, left with nothing but empty promises that they'd relocate us. Promises that never came true." The cafe was silent now, save for the faint hiss of the espresso machine in the background. The man's voice began to crack as he continued, his tough exterior slowly crumbling with each word. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, worked whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you. My wife, she left, took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore." He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't even blame her." Baron remained silent, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the empathy in his eyes. The man's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood absently. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "That's my life, every single day." The words hit hard, not just for Baron, but for everyone listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted in her seat, her eyes glued to her coffee cup as if trying to process what she had just heard. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, "sitting here in your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." His words hung in the air, heavy with frustration and pain. Baron didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's anger settle, respecting the weight of his pain. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Baron said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the cafe lean in a little closer. "But I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly know about that?" Baron's response wasn't what anyone in the cafe expected. It turned the entire conversation and the mood of the room in a direction no one could have predicted. He took a deep breath, his composure steady and unwavering. "You might think I've got it easy because of my name, and in some ways, you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table, but that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood." Baron's voice was calm, but there was an intensity to his words that made the whole room stop and listen. The man scoffed, ready to interrupt, but Baron raised a hand, not dismissively, but as if to say, "Hear me out." "Everywhere I go," Baron continued, "people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto, kind of like what's happening here." The man's face twitched, as if something inside him shifted. He didn't say anything, but his posture loosened slightly, his arms uncrossing just a little. Baron's words had struck a nerve, and for the first time the man didn't look as sure of himself. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours," Baron said, his voice gentle but firm. "They're not, but pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible or like you'll never be understood, that's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe was utterly silent now, thick with thought. Even the barista had stopped mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Baron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb what he had just said. "I'm not here to argue with you," Baron added softly. "I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees, and maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did." The man's jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out again, but instead he exhaled sharply as if releasing something heavy, something he'd been holding on to for far too long. "You really believe that?" he asked quietly, his voice now lacking the edge it had once held. Baron nodded. "I do, and I think maybe deep down you do too. Otherwise you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but then he looked back at Baron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer now. But the real surprise wasn't what Baron said next. It was what the man did in response. The man sat back in his chair, his body language shifting from defensive to contemplative. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The cafe was still, every patron caught in the quiet tension of the moment. Finally, he spoke. "You know, I came in here mad at the world," he said, shaking his head. "Mad at people like you, who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all." Baron didn't respond right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured. "I think it's easy to blame people we don't know. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and I respect that." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Baron's for the first time. There was no trace of anger, only a weary kind of gratitude. "You're a good kid," he said almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. "I don't say that often." The shift in tone was palpable. The tension that had gripped the cafe dissolved, replaced by an unexpected sense of connection. The barista smiled faintly as she resumed her work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Then the man did something that caught everyone off guard. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched. Baron hesitated for only a second before clasping it firmly. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you." Baron smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back. He stood, smoothing his shirt awkwardly, and glanced around the cafe. "I think I owe everyone here an apology, too," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I came in here angry, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we've just got to listen." The cafe erupted in quiet applause, not loud or showy, but heartfelt. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way to the door. He paused just before leaving and looked back at Baron. "Thank you," he said simply. And then he was gone. What happened next wasn't as dramatic, but it left everyone in the cafe with something to think about. a moment they wouldn't soon forget. As the door closed behind him, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. Conversation slowly resumed, but it wasn't the same. There was a new energy in the room, a shared understanding among strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Baron returned to his seat, picked up his book, and took a sip of his now cold tea. But before he could fully retreat into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She looked to be in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "You know, young man," she said softly, "what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Baron nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am. I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled and returned to her table, leaving Baron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Patrons were smiling at each other, striking up conversations, offering small gestures of kindness, holding doors, sharing smiles, even picking up tabs. By the time Baron left the cafe, the day felt brighter, not just for him, but for everyone who had been a part of that moment. The man's anger, Baron's empathy, and the simple act of listening had created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. As Baron walked down the street, he couldn't help but think about how small actions could have such a big impact. He didn't know the man's full story, and he probably never would. But in that cafe, for those few moments, they had connected. And that connection had changed the tone of an entire room. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, Baron thought to himself. Just a little bit of empathy to remind us that we're not so different after all.